Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States, episode 4.48, Reacting to Saratoga. The American victory at Saratoga marked a turning point in the Revolution. The war following the defeat of Burgoyne's army is going to be a very different affair than what we had seen before. The victory at Saratoga will push the war into an entirely different phase, as all the involved parties are going to be forced to reevaluate their positions. This week we are going to look at those changes moving from the inside out. We will begin by looking at the American response to the news, then move to Britain and see how the British are taking it, before we expand out and look at how the European powers, and very specifically here, we are talking about France, reacted to the developments. It will probably not come as much of a surprise that the reaction inside of America, as the news of the victory at Saratoga spread, was jubilation. Really, the American army had yet to score a victory anywhere near the same scale, going all the way back to Bunker Hill in 1775. In 1776, Washington had managed to salvage an otherwise difficult year with his late run of successes that saw the British get pushed nearly out of New Jersey. However, those had been more of a series of successful skirmishes, even during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although the Americans were able to inflict a staggering cost on the British to take Breed's Hill, they did not knock a British army out of the war. They technically did not even win the battle. However, here in 1777, the Northern British Army had been completely defeated. It was sometime around October 16th that George Washington would first learn of the American victory, in a letter that he received from Israel Putnam. Now, if you are thinking back to last week and are remembering that Burgoyne surrendered on the 17th, you would be correct. As it turns out, Putnam was just a little bit premature in his report. However, by this time, the news had already started to spread of Burgoyne's surrender. A few days later, on the 18th, he passed along the information to John Hancock and Congress. On October 22nd, Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams, sharing with him the reports that were coming in regarding a possible American victory over Burgoyne. This is an interesting note because it gives us some information over the reports coming out. However, the fact that Abigail Adams is still hearing rumors speaks some to the nature of how the information was spreading throughout the states. Abigail Adams was living in Braintree, to the south of Boston. Well, the news of the victory had already reached York, Pennsylvania, where the Congress was sitting, and indeed Boston. For all those towns that existed outside of these metropolitan centers, news was much slower coming. Surely, one would believe that the news of Saratoga would be blasted out everywhere. However, in the fall of 1777, the American press network was at a low point. Even before the war had begun, it was these communication networks that had helped define the current struggle and put meaning to what exactly the Americans were fighting for. By the time of Burgoyne's defeat, the Americans had lost New York and Philadelphia, which were each critical nodes in that communication network. Historian Robert Parkinson states that the news ran in just 7 Patriot papers, 5 of which were either in Boston or Williamsburg. This was a very real problem for the American leadership. The news of the stunning victory over Burgoyne desperately needed to be spread throughout the country. Morale was an important thing for both of the armies, and the Americans could not waste such a valuable moment. Making matters worse, per Samuel Adams, Howe was actually printing the opposite in Philadelphia, extolling Burgoyne's victory over Gates. Slow as it was, the news of the victory would spread, largely by word of mouth, towards the South. By the beginning of November, the news had reached as far as South Carolina. Although celebrations followed the news of the victory as it spread, political issues also popped up, as several delegates began whispering, out loud, over questions regarding the leadership of the American army. There had been a growing competition between Washington and Gates for some time. Realistically, Washington really had not had that bad of a year. His army remained in the field, and Howe's capture of Philadelphia was more of a symbolic victory than it was any strategic bounty for the British. However, Washington likely also realized that twice he had been on the cusp of something more. In the case of both Germantown and Brandywine, Washington did have a chance to win, a chance that he did not ultimately capitalize on. Gates, meanwhile, was riding high from the single biggest American success of the entire war. As Washington's army endured their winter at Valley Forge, something that we are going to talk about more next time, Washington found himself appealing to anybody who would listen about the disadvantages that he faced. The relationship between the two men had not been great for a while, going back to the previous year and Washington's seeming support for Schuyler in the North. Gates was likewise a popular New Englander, and was, most importantly, well liked by both Samuel and John Adams. As historian and Washington biographer John Fairleigh points out, Washington was sensitive to criticism and had become convinced that there was a plot out there to remove him from his command, with generals Thomas Conway, Thomas Mifflin, and Gates all working towards his downfall. The fear over these men was not totally without merit either, as Washington had become aware of communications between Conway and Gates, where the former praised the latter for saving the country from a weak general, meaning Washington, and his bad counselors. The degree to which the so-called Conway cabal really was seeking to overthrow Washington, rather than just being critical of him, can be debated. But what cannot be debated is the fact that there really were those who were becoming disenchanted with the Virginian. Dr. Benjamin Rush was openly calling for his removal at this point. Yet, despite these challenges to his leadership, all of the evidence suggests that really much of the actual plan to replace Washington only existed through the occasional whispers and grumbling, rather than through the existence of the rumored cabal. Fairleigh goes on to acknowledge that, despite his fears, nobody ever did make a move against Washington's command, including Conway, Mifflin, or Horatio Gates. As a result of all of this, Conway had initially offered to resign, but at this point, Congress went ahead and rejected him. Realistically, Washington had little to worry about. He still remained widely popular amongst the Congress, and his disadvantages, as well as the advantages that Gates enjoyed at Saratoga, were acknowledged. John Adams, who was sympathetic to the New Englander Gates, disagreed with Dr. Rush, a close personal friend of his. Adams goes so far as to state that Washington losing Philadelphia was probably a net positive, as it kept him from becoming too powerful. Horatio Gates himself did little to help soothe Washington's fears. The two men spent much of the winter locked in a terse battle of letters. Although the letters would remain civil enough, never becoming akin to the communication between, say, Gates and Arnold back in October, it was clear that the relationship between the two men was strained. Washington openly criticized Conway to Gates, who defended him. Whatever these machinations were, by the time that February rolled around, the incident between Washington and Gates seems to have been more or less resolved. However, this does not officially mark the end of the drama. Thomas Conway had come to the United States a few years before, volunteering to fight for the American cause and being named a brigadier general. Following the Battle of Germantown, where Conway had performed well, he was hoping for a promotion. Washington, however, disagreed, instead wishing to promote natural-born Americans in front of him. Where Conway erred was that as he was promoting himself to become a major general, he was also sending those missives critical of Washington, hence the reason for the supposed cabal. There was really never much of a question between who the Congress was going to side with when it came to a battle between Conway and George Washington. Sure enough, Conway was quickly reassigned out to protect a pointless post in the North, most of all to ensure that it did not just up and walk away. However, that was not the end of it. His honor now feeling besmirched, Conway resigned, and this time the Congress actually accepted. Washington had won. He had gotten rid of the troublesome Conway. Unfortunately for Conway, before he left, he got into a war of words with Brigadier General John Cadwalader, The two men agreed to a duel where Cadwallader shot Conway in the mouth. Although Conway would survive the wound and later fight in the French Revolution, his time in the United States was at an end. Despite writing an apology to Washington, the general never responded. We are going to talk much more about the Americans' winter camp next time when we discuss Valley Forge. However, as 1777 came to an end, generally, the mood around the United States was jubilant. Horatio Gates had won a stunning victory. Although Washington had not won a victory per se, it was also hard to be terribly critical of him either. Thomas Conway aside, of course. For all of the revelry in the United States over what had been a relatively successful 1777, in Great Britain, it was another story entirely. It follows that if the Americans should have been having a jubilant, albeit politically loaded response to the events, the British would be staring at a catastrophe. And, sure enough, that was the situation for both the British public and the ministry alike, as reports confirmed Burgoyne's defeat. For what was really the first time, the British were forced to address the fact that the war was not going as well as they had hoped. While they could all acknowledge that things were not going good, the real question was whose fault was it that the British had not crushed the rebellion. Throughout much of 1777, press about the war had turned in an increasingly negative direction. Although the start of the year had seen a general optimism throughout Britain, a lack of information throughout much of the year had led to a mixture of frustration and then worry. The British press was no stranger to exaggeration or rumor-mongering, and had begun the year talking about how victory was likely right around the corner. Reports that George Washington had died and that the American campaign was on the verge of implosion, as well as stories discussing which American leaders were bound for the gallows, were commonplace in Tory papers. Yet, even before Burgoyne's defeat, not everybody was so optimistic. The opposition Whig press was already raising eyebrows when looking at the current situation and arguing that it was already unlikely that this war was going to end well for the British. One paper pointed out that fear that Howe had expressed some years before, that if the Americans could simply stay in the field, laying entrenchments and fortifications upon all their hills, it would be virtually impossible for the British to ever prevail. As 1777 rolled on, a lack of news appearing in the papers convinced many that the British were struggling. Unfortunately for Howe, much of the blame fell squarely on his shoulders, and quickly he would become the favorite scapegoat. Even with Howe's capture of Philadelphia, many papers, both for and against the American war, believed that the general was at the end of his line in America. Everybody was busy questioning why he was moving at such a glacial pace. In June 1778, an article in the General Evening Post, a Tory paper, referred to Howe as being the sleepy general. In fact, most of the animosity would not fall onto the shoulders of Burgoyne himself, but rather on the ministry back at home, as well as on the shoulders of Howe, who had failed repeatedly to put down some backwater provincials. As the scope of Burgoyne's defeat became clear, the press had a field day. Inside the ministry, MP Edward Gibbon told Horace Walpole that the war was fueled by shame, and that deep down the vast majority of Parliament was desperate for peace. This is, if you're wondering, the same Edward Gibbon who would write The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Even beyond Gibbon, though, more and more throughout the halls of power inside of London, and certainly in the Tory press, there was an increasing understanding, not just that the war was going poorly, but an acknowledgement that realistically, the American colonies were probably lost. In what may have seemed to be the most incendiary piece, at least to British national pride, in February 1778, the Morning Chronicle blamed the British defeat on Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, raising the even most unthinkable thought that maybe the British had simply been beaten. At least amongst the Tory papers, this thought was unthinkable, and assigning blame proved to be far more palatable of an option. even as 1778 moved along and official inquiries were opened to find out exactly what had happened, you really do see an increased sense of doom spreading throughout the British press. Even the Whig papers, rather than assigning blame to either Burgoyne or Howe, turned to the fact that the American war was an impossible feat for anybody. These papers, rather than blaming the military leadership, often found themselves looking at the ministry for answers on how they could have allowed the situation in the first place. Regardless of who was at fault, and realistically, there is probably enough fault to be passed around for how the war was going, the British were forced to look seriously at the fact that they might not retain their American colonies. The British, however, had bigger problems. If the American victory at Saratoga had marked an inflection point in the war, a point where everything that follows Saratoga is different than anything that came before it, we need to look at why that was. The British still had a lot going for them. Howe had a large army in Philadelphia. It certainly was not a complete defeat by any means. However, as news of Saratoga sank in, the British suddenly found themselves looking at a situation that was so radically different than what they had been dealing with just a few months earlier. The situation was in fact so much different, and frankly so much more dire, that Lord North had begun looking at the possibilities that had, not long before, seemed unthinkable. The question therefore becomes, what had changed that would so completely rewrite British strategy? The answer is the French. Back in episode 4.44, we talked about the French. The French had been, somewhat clandestinely, sending weapons to the Americans. French Foreign Minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was also, and no, there are some big air quotes here, accidentally allowing American privateers to retrofit their ships in French ports, and then pretending like they had absolutely no idea that this was going on. Now, of course, the British knew exactly what the French were doing, but really there was not much that they could do about it. If the British wanted to call out the French for providing those weapons or allowing the use of their ports, well, the remedy would be war, the very thing that the British were actively trying to avoid. The French, for their part, continued to vacillate on the subject of a full alliance with the Americans, an alliance that would surely drag them into the war. Although Vergennes was licking his chops at the opportunity to get back at the British for those perceived humiliations at the end of the 7 Years' War, he too had some problems. First and foremost, the Spanish were not interested in recognizing the United States as an independent country, fearing what such a precedent might mean for their vast American holdings. Second, the French continually worried about the Americans in the war, and whether or not this was an endeavor worth backing. Sticking it to the British, well, that sounded great. However, the last thing that the French could afford to do was pick a losing horse in this race. However, in December, when news of Burgoyne's defeat started to arrive in Europe, both the British and the French were forced to face a new reality. For the British, this meant accepting that the war was not going well, and that, as a consequence, the French might decide to jump into that war and drag the British in directions that they really wished to avoid. Lord North concluded that what might be the best plan, therefore, was swallowing his pride and giving the Americans what they were asking for. As the news spread, in December 1777, North reached out to the American delegation in Paris and made them an offer of what amounted to home rule. Under this offer, the British would have retained the colonies. However, all matters of internal policy would have now belonged to the Americans. This was, largely, the exact thing that the Americans had wanted. It may well have been the kind of thing that, if offered in, let's say, 1774, would have completely avoided the war altogether. Now, however, the American delegates, specifically Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin, were far less amenable to the idea of reconciliation. The American delegation made clear to the British agents that any kind of peace needed to be predicated upon a recognition of the independence of the United States. The possibility for reconciliation between the British and the Americans was a nightmare for Vergennes. Suddenly, his chance to restore the balance of power in Europe and repair that stained French prestige might be in danger. The American Revolution was an opportunity being presented on a silver platter, and the last thing that Vergennes wanted to do was waste a moment that might never come back. Feeling the pressure from this moment, and worried that everything was starting to slip away from him, Vergennes gave the American delegation the very thing that they had been asking for. And on December 17th, 1777, just 10 days after learning of Burgoyne's surrender, promised the Americans recognition and a formal alliance. For the sake of maintaining our timeline, Vergennes' promise came 2 days after Dean had spoken with the British agent, but 3 weeks before Franklin made clear that peace would require recognition of American independence. To be sure, the promise that Vergennes had made to the Americans did not solve all of his problems. Although Burgoyne's surrender exposed British weakness, it failed to substantially move the Spanish. Vergennes did what he could to stall after making the promise to the American delegation, in hopes that he could convince the Spanish to join the war. But on January 8th, with the Spanish essentially ghosting the French, he went ahead and informed the Americans that King Louis XVI was also on board with the treaty. The Spanish, for their part, were not at all amused with the promises being made. Although they too wanted to restore some of their glory, the very last thing that they wanted to do was recognize American independence, lest some of their own holdings get the memo that independence was a thing that could exist. On February 6, 1778, the treaty between the French and the Americans became official. To be more specific, there were actually 2 treaties that were signed that day, one of them dealing with a military alliance and the other addressing a commercial relationship. The terms of this alliance were extraordinarily favorable to the Americans. Vergennes was aware that the British were also now doing what they could to open a dialogue for peace, meaning that the last thing that Vergennes could afford was to waste additional time negotiating the minutiae of an agreement. The French, as is, already had stalled as much as they could in hopes that the Spanish would change their minds. The commercial treaty, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, was close to what Congress had sent the delegation over with in 1776. It was essentially the proverbial wish list of the Americans. It granted the United States a commercial agreement to begin much-needed international trade with the French. It likewise granted mutual, most favored nation status to both the French and the Americans. There was an interesting twist here that would become standard practice for the Americans, where if an American port was given to another nation for some kind of compensation, then the most favored nation would essentially be given a similar offer for similar compensation. In other words, rather than this being a straight trading of ports or completely open trade between the two nations, the most favored nation status afforded the two countries more of a promise to give the other their best possible deal. It was likewise accepted that in the future, beneficial trade deals and special favors should be recognized between the two powers. Critically, the treaty was not predicated on there actually being a war, although realistically the treaty would be pretty pointless without an independent United States. In fact, it was this treaty that, by its very nature, saw France recognize the United States as an independent nation. The second treaty was the Franco-American Treaty of Alliance. Now, this treaty was, technically, provisional. Public perception was then, as it remains today, a very big deal. Nobody wanted to be seen as the aggressor in a matter of war. Think back for a moment to the Jumonville affair during the French and Indian War. Does war break out between the British and the French in North America if Jumonville isn't killed by Washington and his small party? I would wager that the answer is probably an emphatic yes. The Jumonville affair, however, provided the French with the cover necessary to ensure that their war against the British was going to be a defensive war, in response to the killing of their emissary. The French were itching for a war. However, they could not exactly come out and just declare it. They needed to give Great Britain a chance to provoke a war, and give the French the optics of claiming that they were fighting a defensive battle. Through the commercial treaty with the United States, the French did greatly increase the number of items that could move between the two countries, something which was designed largely to make it that much easier for them to provoke the British into taking action against them. The first article of the alliance made clear that in the event that there was an outbreak of war between Britain and France, the two countries would work together to fight a common British enemy. Most critically among these provisions were that the two nations would aid each other in a war against Britain, and that they would fight until American independence was assured. That they would protect each other's holdings in North America, and that neither the French nor the Americans would agree to a peace without the other. That last part was designed to give the French some reassurance that the Americans were not going to just bail out of the war and leave the French holding the bag. The treaty also limited French territorial gains to lands that had not belonged to Great Britain prior to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. In other words, this meant that the French were prohibited from helping the Americans win the war, and then deciding that they wanted to peel off the Carolinas for themselves. More realistically, it indicated that the French were not making designs on the reconquest of Canada. The treaty that the French had just agreed to was stunning in its scope. The nation was desperate to help the Americans achieve independence, not because of any magnanimous feelings towards the rights of Americans, but rather because they were desperate to restore some of their luster by diminishing that of the British. Even at the time of the treaty, there were warnings for the French that this might be a mistake. French Finance Minister Jacques Turgot warned Louis XVI that France really did not have the money for a war, and that essentially printing money for the Americans was a bad idea that would bankrupt the nation. Now, if you know anything about the next 20 or so years of French history, you probably know that Turgot was not wrong. France really did not have the money for this war. Even though the official treaty had been signed, what now emerged was something of a race between the British and the French. The British were immediately aware that the treaty had been reached. Edward Bancroft, who had been working as a secretary for Franklin, unfortunately turned out to be a British spy. Ironically, the American delegation knew that Bancroft was a spy. The problem was that they thought he was spying for them and not against them. On March 9th, the British Parliament had agreed to the concessions that North was seeking, those concessions that would have essentially granted the Americans home rule. There was a brief hope that maybe the British might be able to get their concessions ratified by Congress before word of the French alliance made its way across the Atlantic. In truth, it was close. Congress had heard very little from the Paris delegation since they had left, and it is not out of the question that they would have opened negotiations with the British peace delegation should they have arrived first. However, the French treaties beat the British delegation, and on May the 4th, 1778, the United States Congress ratified the treaties. The United States was no longer in the war alone, having finally secured a major ally. The alliance with France would also mark official recognition by a major European power. The entry of the French into the war really would change everything. The American Revolution, up to this point, had been an internal matter for the British. It was a civil war. Now, however, with the involvement of the French, it meant that the war was going to take on a far more global reach. There was still a whole lot of bad blood between the American population and the French. Nobody had forgotten the last 3/4 of a century, where they fought war after war against their new allies. However, as historian Woody Holton puts it, the entry of the French meant, at bare minimum, the British were now going to have to extend their resources that much further. By March of 1778, the British were already removing troops from the United States and moving them south to secure Florida, and then further down into the Caribbean. whatever came next, it was abundantly clear to everybody that the war in America was a much different affair than it had been just 6 months earlier. Technically, though, France was not yet at war with Great Britain. Recall from just a few moments ago that the treaty was written in such a way that Britain was going to actually have to do something to provoke the war. Now, of course, France had cast a pretty big net, and had made it very easy for such provocations to take place. On June 17th, some 30 miles off the southern coast of England, a minor naval skirmish took place when the British attempted to stop the French from learning the size and location of their fleet. Although the battle itself was completely inconsequential, it is the justification that the French needed. The now adequately provoked French declared war on Great Britain just a few weeks later. With the transformation of the revolution into a global war, the British are going to be forced to reconsider their position in America. The war was now far more complicated, and critically, was going to be far more costly than it had been before. That is, however, not to say that the Americans were having an easy go of things either, as the winter of 1778 would bring with it legendary cold and misery for the American troops in their quarters at Valley Forge. Next time, we are going to spend our episode setting up the campaigns of 1778. As the British grapple with the loss of Burgoyne's army and the entry of the French into the war, the Americans found themselves having to battle the elements throughout that brutal winter at Valley Forge. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you all back here next time as we prepare for the campaigns of 1778.